For 33 years, I followed the prudent diet and believed that carbohydrates were crucial for good health. And I wrote a book called Law of Running, which was widely read, and that promoted very high carbohydrate diets. And that's what I did when I was running competitively. And then I suddenly had this epiphanous moment when I realized that I was getting sicker and sicker eating these high carbohydrate diets. And I realized I had to understand what was going wrong, and then found that when I reduced my carbohydrates to almost absent, I regained my health that I'd last had 20 or 30 years before. Now, what I also learned was that as a medical practitioner, I have a responsibility, an ethical responsibility, if I made an error, to say, I'm sorry, I made the error. And that's what I did in December 2010. I came out and said that what I'd said before was completely wrong, and that those who had copies of Law of Running needed to tear out the nutrition section, and we needed to start all over again. So the idea that carbohydrate is so crucially important was the result of studies that started in the 1960s, in which Scandinavian scientists particularly, but then we started doing it, and I was the first guy ever to do a muscle biopsy on an athlete in Africa. And so it came to Africa, and we started measuring the carbohydrate content of muscle. And the theory that the Scandinavians developed was that the more carbohydrate you had in your muscles, the more glycogen, in other words, the better you could run, and you could run for longer at higher intensities. But if you actually go back and look at the original data, it's not so great. And we were the first also to do a placebo-controlled trial where athletes didn't know what they were actually getting. And when they didn't know, it made no difference what they ate. So, but when we did that study, I kind of forgot about it, you see, because I knew that the study couldn't be right, because we all knew that carbohydrates worked. So I think that the sugar industry particularly has come up and said that no, sugar gives you go, and that's the way they marketed the product. And that seems to be the message that's stuck in people's heads. And so when I speak to athletes about, actually, maybe you don't need that much carbohydrate, the common statement is, carbohydrates are absolutely essential for high-intensity exercise. And then we start to analyze, we'd say, but actually, you're doing the Ironman triathlon, so tell me, how long do you take to run your marathon? About 4.5 to 5 hours. I said, well, is that high-intensity exercise? Actually not. So then I said, well, maybe you don't need all that carbohydrate to do that low-intensity exercise. I think I think there are a number of problems for athletes who believe they must take lots of carbohydrates. If you are a world-class leading athlete and you're lean and you're able to stay lean eating lots of carbohydrates, I suspect it probably is beneficial, and that maybe you do get a little bit of a boost from the carbohydrates. But that's really for the world-class athletes competing in short events lasting maybe 15 minutes or so. Once you are no longer really competitive and you're a little overweight, you're not going to benefit from carbohydrates. You're going to benefit much more by reducing your carbohydrates. So when I go and watch major races in South Africa, we have a famous race, the Comrades Marathon, which is 90 kilometers or 56 miles. Most of the athletes take between 10.5 and 12 hours to finish the race. These are not elite athletes. They walk substantial distances. And if you look at their body shape, it's not like an elite Kenyan runner. That's quite the opposite. Many of them had body mass index well over 25, perhaps 27 kilograms per meter squared. And those people are obese. And they're obese because they're eating so much carbohydrate. And the reality is if they cut their carbohydrates, they'll lose weight. And without doing one extra step of training, they'll run much better. So that's the message that I'm trying to get out, that if you are an elite athlete and you're lean and you're performing well, absolutely stay with the carbohydrates. But once you start getting towards middle age and you're putting on weight, that is telling you that those carbohydrates are doing you no good. And you really need to reduce your carbohydrate intake. What is really interesting is that I helped Bruce Fordyce, who won 9 Comrades Marathons. It's a remarkable performance. It'll never be matched again. And I told him, you've got to eat all the carbohydrates in the world. And we were the first to develop with him and another runner the goos that are currently used. We were the first to develop the goo in South Africa, and it was called FRN, Fordyce, Rose and Noakes. So the two of us have been linked together with that product. What happened was that towards the end of his career, Bruce was maybe a kilogram or two heavier, and he wasn't quite as good an athlete, but yet he was able to win. Throughout the next 20 or 30 years, he gradually put on a little bit of weight. His running became relatively much less good, until the point was he came and said, what can I do? I'm running poorly. And the decision was taken, cut the carbs, and particularly cut sugar. And he lost 12 kilograms. Now, this is a guy who's run 200 marathons, and many of them in very fast times. And he loses 12 kilograms, and his running came right back. And he was the second runner in his age group in the New York City Marathon 2 years ago. And he's running remarkably well. He's probably the top Masters runner in South Africa. But the key point was, a few weeks ago, he came to me and he said, Tim, I've just run the 56-kilometer, 35-mile race in Cape Town. I did not carbohydrate load. I'm 56 years old. I did not take a drop of carbohydrate I just drank water during the race. And I had a very comfortable race. I never felt that I needed any carbohydrate. And Tim, I want to ask you one question. What do you think would have happened if I'd followed this diet when I was winning those races? Maybe I could have gone even faster. And he set the records, which in fact were only broken 30 years later. But he has obviously experienced something in his running to make him question whether he should have eaten all those carbohydrates that I encouraged him to eat 35 years ago or so. What we observe when we advise runners what they should be eating and drinking during races is they actually do what they do during the normal day, they also do in races. And it's very clear that there are two quite distinct groups. The people who eat a lot of carbohydrates and are eating every 3 hours during their normal day, they have a big breakfast of carbohydrates, and by tea time, 3 hours later, they're eating more carbohydrates. In races, they do exactly the same. They carbohydrate load, they take a massive carbohydrate load for breakfast, and then every few minutes, every half hour or so, they will take a huge carbohydrate load during the race, and they are petrified of changing it. And I also think that if they were to change that, they wouldn't run very well. In other words, they are so carbohydrate dependent that they have to take carbohydrate at high rates during races. The other group are the fat-adapted athletes, and it's clear to me that they take much fewer calories during races, and they will mainly take in fat and protein. They might take a little bit of carbohydrate, but they eat fat and protein at a much lower rate than the carbohydrate guzzlers. And in those adventure races where you have teams where some are carb eaters and some are fat eaters, it becomes very apparent that the carb eaters are always looking for carbohydrates and have to load up before they start to make sure they've got enough carbohydrate. The fat eaters do fine. They don't worry about needing to add stuff when they're running. So the difference is that you've only got so much carbohydrate in the body, and there's a real probability that you will run out during a race, let's say, of 3 hours. And I think what's happening is the brain tells the athlete, listen, if you don't take more carbohydrate, we're going to run out and you're going to slow down. If you're fat adapted, you will produce all the carbohydrate you need because we have this liver that can generate carbohydrate from all sources, from fat and protein. It doesn't need to be filled with carbohydrate all the time. And the beauty is you take your energy in your muscles and in your fat cells, and it just provides all the energy you need. So the people who really benefit from this diet are those who learn to burn fat exclusively. And they do best when they don't take any carbohydrate during racing. That's my experience. I can't say that that's scientifically proven as yet. We did studies on fat adaptation. In fact, we started doing them 20 years ago, and we've repeatedly done them. And the main finding was that some people did very well on this diet, but generally they didn't do quite as well on the diet. But we did very short trials. We only did a 7-day trial. And that's far too short to adapt to these diets. And the benefit So we see, and I experienced myself, my performances went up over 6 months. And in fact, 2.5 years later, they started to go up again. And it's because I've made some subtle changes again. So I think that it's a very long-term process for your body, for you to adapt and to get the ideal diet. And I also think that what we're going to find is what we really do to our bodies is we change the flora of the gut. And they then eventually you find the right flora which generate all the nutrients that you need. And I take this beautiful example, and I always ask people, why do all mammals not eat the same foods? And the answer is because we co-evolved with bacteria which provide us with the nutrients that we don't get in our diet. The best example is the African giraffe, this enormous animal, which just eats one plant source, the acacia plants. And if you were to take an acacia leaf and analyze it, you would not find that it's got vitamin B and vitamin A and vitamin C in the concentrations that the giraffe needs. And the only conclusion must be that the bacteria in the gut are turning those acacia leaves into what the animal needs. And I've seen some dramatic responses in athletes that you can't explain other than by changing their diet, they are getting much more nutrients than they had before. And that was my own experience, that the performance changes were just too dramatic. They had to be because my nutrition was poor. But if you actually looked at the nutrition, it didn't look too bad. And I probably was getting pretty much the nutrients I needed. But something was missing. And I think that for those of us who benefit enormously, the fat in the diet does something beyond what we can explain at the present. So although I'm a medical doctor, I've really taught exercise physiology all my life. So I'm really an exercise scientist who does practice clinical medicine now and again. And during this period, I have believed that it's the amount of exercise you do that's the critical factor determining your health. And I think that in the books that I've written, that probably is the theme that comes across. And it's partly because we knew so little about nutrition. Doctors are not taught, and exercise scientists know a little bit about nutrition, but not very much. What I now believe is the exact opposite, that it's nutrition is the much more important determinant of our health. We face a double problem that exercise scientists are never going to say that nutrition is more important than exercise science, because then they degrade the importance of their profession. However, my impression and my belief now is that nutrition is utterly critical. And I've given you the example of Bruce Fordyce, who ran 200 marathons but couldn't control his weight. I was regularly active. I ran 70 marathons and ultramarathons. I could not regulate my weight. But the instant I changed my diet, whether I exercised or not, my weight just dropped off. And now I can keep my weight absolutely rock solid. Whether I run 20 kilometers a day or not, my weight is absolutely stable. So now I absolutely believe that if you have to exercise to regulate your weight, your diet is wrong. And you have to address the dietary factors. And that, to me, is one of the best tests of people that I speak to. I say, is your weight constant when you stop exercising, when you go on holiday? Or when you reduce your training at the end of the season? And those people whose weight shift goes up, they're eating too much carbohydrate for them, for their particular metabolism. And if they were just to cut the carbohydrates, they wouldn't have to train as much. And that has been a uniform result. And I have people who will go into training and lose 10 kilograms during a season, 6 months of training for a big marathon. But 3 months later, they're back to where they started. Now we change their diets. And at the start of training, they're lighter than they were at the point where they were racing. And it's remarkably important because now they can train much harder. Because with less weight, there's less damage to joints, and you don't carry all this extra weight around. And they can train harder, and their performances start to improve. Not just because they're lighter during races, but because they can train harder. The remarkable irony is that when in the 1970s athletes were told they must eat more carbohydrates, at exactly the same time, everyone was told that they needed to start eating more carbohydrates. And you see, the athletes are doing it, so it must be good for you. And the two occurred almost at the same time. And the consequence was that whilst the athletes, some of them could survive eating the high carbohydrate diets because they burn more carbohydrates and perhaps they're more carbohydrate tolerant, we exposed the people who least needed carbohydrates to this massive carbohydrate load. And it's no surprise that that was followed very quickly by the rise in diabetes and obesity, starting in the 1980s and exemplified by what's happened in the United States of America. So it's, in my view, entirely explicable that if you have people who are slightly carbohydrate intolerant and you take out the fat of the diet, which they can metabolize much more easily, and replace it with carbohydrate, there's only one way to go, and that is increasing obesity and ultimately leading to diabetes. So the message that I try to tell people is if your body mass index is above 25, you're eating too much carbohydrate, because obesity tells you that for your metabolism, you've got too much carbohydrate in your diet. And the quicker you take it out, the better for your long-term health. I think that even the leaner people in our communities are 5 or 6 kilograms, maybe 12 to 15 pounds too heavy. And that's what I've noticed in my lifetime, that when I was younger, people were, I suspect, the lean ones were still 5 or 6 kilograms leaner than the lean people today. So there's been this general shift of about 5 or 6 kilograms. But the most important point is, if you're not physically active, you don't need much carbohydrate. If your body mass index is over 25, if your body mass index is also over 25, you're eating too much carbohydrate, and your health will benefit dramatically by reducing your carbohydrate intake.
Now,
I've had the privilege of treating morbidly obese people and having them lose massive amounts of weight. My best patient lost 50% of his body mass, from 160 kilograms down to 80 kilograms. So he went from being morbidly obese, needing bariatric surgery, to being healthy, normal, within 7 months. And his diabetes disappeared and his metabolic syndrome disappeared. And you only have to see 1 or 2 cases like that. And we know that those 2 conditions are entirely curable. But you have to understand what the cure is. And the cure really is very simple, that people at 160 kilograms have an addictive eating disorder. And as soon as they understand that, and you can identify which the addictive foods are, you solve the problem. You have to obviously teach them that they must avoid addictive foods, just like any other addiction. So it's treating the addiction, and you can cure the problem. Most of the addictive foods are carbohydrate-based, and particularly sugar is critical to the whole process. But carbohydrates in general are the key drivers of those addictions. And once you can get the patient off the carbohydrates and replace it with fat, the problem starts to resolve itself. Now, my belief is that humans are designed to search for fat. If you look at the history of the hunter-gatherers, be they the Plains Indians in America who lived off the bison, or the sand bushmen in South Africa who hunted the eland, which was the most fatty animal. So if you look at the hunter-gatherer populations, be they the Plains Indians of North America or the bushmen, the sand bushmen of South Africa, they killed the fattest animals. And the bison, of course, was the classic example. But they went first for the fat. They didn't go for the meat, and they were absolute experts on the different fat components of the body. The same with the Bushmen. The Bushmen would first eat the fat, and they would save the meat for any other things that when they didn't need, when the fat was not available. And if you go to the Inuit as well, the Eskimo were exactly the same. So the question is, what happened? And the answer is, if you look back in history, sugar came along in the 1700s. And as humans ate more sugar, their desire to eat fat became less and less and less. And that's, in my view, what's happened. We've replaced the natural human desire to eat fat with this desire to eat carbohydrate, or particularly sugar. And that has had a massive effect, because you can't regulate your body weight if you're eating a lot of sugar and a lot of carbohydrate. So the real problem in obesity is that we have a homeostat in the brain which regulates our weight by making sure that we always eat just enough to offset how much exercise we do. Now, obesity it absolutely cannot be because we're doing too little exercise, because in a regulated system, all that happens is if you do less exercise, you do eat less. And that's why once you're on this high-fat diet, your weight's stable, because if you don't exercise on a particular day, you just eat less. And if you exercise more, you eat more, but it's always in balance. And that's what happened to humans for 3.5 million years before the My Pyramid came along in 1977. And the My Pyramid actively destroys the homeostat in the brain and causes us to overeat and unable to regulate our body weight. And once people understand that, then we can start curing them of obesity and all the other added complications that occur in obese people. The great sadness is, if you go and look back to the lead up to the 1977 dietary guidelines, which gave us the food pyramid, there was not one clinical trial to see whether that diet would make us healthier than if we continued to eat our fatty diets, which was considered to be so detrimental and dangerous. Not one single clinical trial. And the scientists at the time, who were independent of industry and government, warned that. They said, we haven't had these trials. How can we expose the American public to this giant experiment unless we know what the outcome will be? Well, the reality is 30 years later, we know exactly what the outcome has been. What's happened now is there's a lot of research trying to retrospectively prove that what they did was right. And unfortunately, that you can't do that. You can't have ad hoc, post hoc research to prove something like that. And tragically, industry, in my view, is involved, and they make it much more acceptable for scientists to find in favor of the dietary pyramid. And those who want to bring forth evidence against it find it very difficult to find the funding or to find the publications. And the great sadness is that most of the evidence that has been collected post hoc to prove that this dietary change was healthy is associational studies. And the problem in associational studies is that the scientist himself or herself can decide what to mine down to find related to whatever the outcome is, like health or heart disease. And if that scientist has a bias towards cereals and grains or carbohydrates, that's exactly what they will find. And the other problem with associational studies is that the healthiest people, like myself, as I was in 1977 when I went on this diet, I was running, I've never smoked, I was relatively lean for most of the time. And we were healthy people. We slept a lot, and we were clever and we were intelligent, and all the things from the high social classes, all the things that make for health, but we also happened to eat cereals and grains for breakfast. So then the focus became it was the cereals and grains you had for breakfast that made you healthy, but it wasn't. It was this whole array of other things that happened. And that's why we've got now a large number of associational studies supposedly proving that if you eat more cereals and grains, you're going to live longer. But in my view, it's association that 30 years ago, people who were eating those foods were doing many other things. And it's all those other things that made them healthier. And it probably the cereals and grains made them less healthy. And if they'd avoided the cereals and grains, they would have been even more healthy. one of the complaints of the high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet is it's completely unsustainable, which to me is ridiculous because I've been doing it now close to 3 years and I find it the easiest thing to do in the world. The problem is it's the addictive nature of the carbohydrates, and if you don't understand the addiction and you don't treat the addiction, then of course you're going to relapse. So the reason why dietary advice fails is because current dietary advice says you must reduce your calories, but you can continue to eat all the same foods, which means you've got the addictive foods in there, which is exactly the same as saying you must cut your cigarettes to 1 cigarette a day. You can, from 20 to go down to 1. If you continue to smoke 1 cigarette a day, eventually you're back at 20, as everyone knows. And that's the reality. So you have to treat it as an addiction. And if you understand the addictive nature of carbohydrates and you're prepared to stick it out, and you're also prepared to do some cognitive reprogramming, and that's very important. And I've done it for myself completely subconsciously, but I in fact was tested recently for my carbohydrate addiction status with subliminal testing. And the test proved that I've got an utter aversion to carbohydrate. Whereas 3 years ago, I was living on carbohydrates. So I have subtly reprogrammed my brain. And I think that that's what happens to the successful people on this diet. They learn to suppress the subliminal images of carbohydrates and link that to something that is negative, not positive. And so when I see a carbohydrate now, I see it's trying to kill me, so I'm not going to eat it. And then it becomes very easy. The reality is that the high-fat diet is much more satiating and much more tasty than these addictive foods. So if you're eating addictive foods, yes, of course you get a rush, but that's an addiction rush. If you want to taste really good food, then you want to eat high-fat, high-protein foods because they are utterly delicious. So what we tell our patients is, firstly, you have an addiction, and what is the addiction? And they'll always tell you, chocolate or potatoes or bread, Coca-Cola, whatever. So we say, fine, those are the addictions. We understand them. You have to get rid of them. Because if you leave one of them untouched, you will go back to where you were. And then you have to have, obviously, a really good reason. And the best reason is that you're not well, or that you really want to look good, and then that makes a difference. So you have to understand the addictive nature, and then you have to start programming yourself and understand the rules. And the beauty of this diet is the rules are so simple. The food choices are relatively small, and so that it's very easy for you to think all the time about them. When you go into a room, you say, no, I can't eat that, can't eat that, can't eat that. And that's affirmation. And that's the way you overcome the addiction and the desire to eat those foods. So yes, if you don't give patients the right messaging, of course they're going to relapse because they're not told it's an addiction. And I suspect that many of the bariatric surgeons who tell us that the patients can't be cured don't understand that they're treating an addiction. And you have to be absolutely ruthless and rigorous in what you can and what you can't eat. And if you stray one day, the chances are you're going to go straight back to where you started. It's my definite impression that since I've started eating more fat, my mental faculties have improved. And I'm certainly much less sleepy, which I suspect was related to my diabetes and high glucose, affecting my ability to concentrate. So there's been a major change. And that then made me question whether part of the dementia of Alzheimer's disease, isn't that related to a high carbohydrate diet? And there's certainly associational studies coming out now linking both sugary drinks and high carbohydrate diets to Alzheimer's disease, which is considered now to be type 3 diabetes, where the brain becomes carbohydrate resistant. And then it's got nothing to burn, except if you're burning fats and you've got ketone bodies, then you can save your brains. I think that as you get older, you need more of the substrates for the brain, which is fat. So I think that there is going to be found a link between too much carbohydrate in the diet and Alzheimer's disease, We're not quite there yet, but certainly if I was to advise people when they're turning 50, 55, you better start cutting the carbohydrates and you need much more fat in the diet. So I think the evidence is really clear that if you want to keep your brain in function, you better eat a lot of fat. And as you get older, the more fat, the better. And I also have a bias to think it needs to be saturated fat, that our cells are struggling to get enough saturated fat from pasture-fed animals, really high-quality fat. And interestingly, the healthiest high-fat eaters I've seen are the ones who push the saturated fat, but who also make sure that it comes from pasture-raised animals. So my bias is to believe that when you look at all the evidence, humans are designed to eat a high-fat diet, and we actively search out that high-fat diet. I appreciate that there are populations in Asia who do not eat a high-fat diet because they developed agriculture earlier, because probably they had to, because perhaps there were no animals to eat, so they had to produce the cereals and grains. And I understand that they are relatively healthy. They're not, I don't believe, as healthy as they could be, but they're relatively healthy eating high carbohydrate, high cereal grains diets. But for many of us, I come from the north of England, that's where my parents come from. North of England, you couldn't grow cereals and grains until very recently, within perhaps 2,000 to 4,000 years. And we haven't had the time to adapt to this new diet. So on that basis, many of us are designed to eat a high-fat diet. What we did when we took the fat out of the diet and we went low-fat, we put sugar in its place. Because as soon as you take fat out of the diet, the food tastes so terrible that you have to trick the brain into thinking it's healthy, so you add sugar, and then you get the sugar addiction which takes over. The evidence presented by Dr. Volek of the University of Connecticut is that if you eat high-fat diets, all your coronary risk factors improve, without exception. The problem is that most people don't know what the coronary risk factors are. And they think it's just cholesterol, and as soon as you get a number above 5, you're going to die, or value about 200 in American units. And that is completely bogus. There are at least 10 blood measures that you need to measure to work out your state of health. And the only one that might be slightly better is cholesterol on a high carbohydrate diet. Every other one is improved by a high-fat diet. So the question then, well, is the cholesterol value so important? And the answer is it's not. It's nowhere near as important as many of your other variables. And my bias is to believe that your glucose status, your carbohydrate status, is the single most important predictor. And it has to be, because we know that diabetes is, next to smoking, the single most important risk factor for heart disease. And diabetes does not act through changing your cholesterol metabolism. It acts through changing your carbohydrate metabolism. So under those circumstances, my argument is that if you're on a high-fat diet and your cholesterol goes above 200, it doesn't matter because it's balanced by everything else. And in fact, the value of 200 is also made up by industry and is far too low to be something one should worry about. What should be worried about is your lipoproteins, and that's your LDL cholesterol, but the particle size. And the particle size gets bigger the more fat in the diet, and the big LDL particles are safer than the small ones, which are the ones that get oxidized and damage arteries. My conclusion from what I've experienced and working with patients is that we can all tolerate a certain amount of carbohydrate. And if you go beyond that amount, you will generally put on weight, and you'll develop the metabolic syndrome, develop diabetes, and have all the complications, including Alzheimer's disease. On the other hand, if you're able to metabolize carbohydrate, then probably you really don't have to worry about how much carbohydrate you take in. The problem is that the marker of carbohydrate intolerance is usually increasing obesity. However, there is a group of people who are lean but are also have the metabolic syndrome in the sense that they don't metabolize carbohydrate properly. And when they take in carbohydrate, just like the fat people, they're unable to store the carbohydrate in their muscles and their liver, and instead they turn it into fat, into triglycerides, and they develop a fatty liver, and they have all the other abnormalities. And they will also develop pre-diabetes and go on to develop diabetes. So the message is that if you're fat, you need to have a screen to see if you've got abnormal carbohydrate metabolism. And if you do, then you should reduce your carbohydrates till your blood glucose concentration is normal. And what you'll find is once your metabolism is perfect, your weight will be perfect. The two go together because the controls of weight and glucose are very closely linked in the brain. On the other hand, if you are lean and you have a family history of diabetes, then it's entirely possible you could be carbohydrate intolerant as well, and you need also to be screened. And if you have any of these abnormalities, then also you must reduce your carbohydrates, and you will also become leaner as a consequence. But your health in the long term will be much improved. So it really doesn't matter whether you're lean or fat, you still really need to check, are you able to metabolize carbohydrates safely? And that you need to be tested for your carbohydrate tolerance. And only if you're that tiny fraction of the population who is highly carbohydrate tolerant, should you then be allowed to eat any amount of carbohydrates. For the rest of us, we need to find the absolute minimum carbohydrate intake that maximizes our health, minimizes our weight, and also improves our carbohydrate metabolism until it is as good as it can be. Because if we avoid that, ultimately we will develop diabetes.